holidays are coming up, and for me, that means making festive holiday gifts. So I was really happy when Simplicity sent me some great supplies and asked me to create a DIY seasonal accessory for this stuffed fox, which I actually made using one of their patterns in a video over on Simplicity's channel. This was my first time working with one of Simplicity's patterns, and I'm super happy with the way it came out. The pattern provided me with everything I needed to know to make it, including pattern pieces that fit together, a list of the materials that I needed to make it, and surprisingly easy step-by-step instructions for the whole project. So now that I've made the fox, I've decided to make a wintry snowflake scarf to give it a little extra handmade holiday cheer. You can use this tutorial to make this snuggly accessory for any stuffed animal or doll, whether it's a toy that you sew together yourself, buy in a store, or already own. This scarf is simple and inexpensive to make, but it'll give whatever little creature wears it a special homemade touch. And I think that it would be perfect to give as a gift this season. Here's how it's done. Read the video description below for a list of all the materials you'll need for this project. This scarf is made out of a pretty small amount of felt depending on the size of the doll who will be wearing it. Wrap some measuring tape around the toy as if it were a scarf, then decide how long you want the scarf to hang. I decided that mine would be 18 inches long and 1¼ inches wide. Next, measure and cut enough felt so your scarf will have 2 layers. Because the felt sheets I used are only 12 inches long, I divided the 18-inch strips in half, meaning that I'd need 4 pieces total, each of them a 9 by 1¼ inch rectangle. To make this easier, I measured out that shape on paper first and cut it out so I could use it as a template. If you feel comfortable measuring and cutting the felt directly, you could totally do that instead. I pinned my template to the felt and cut around it using these Martha Stewart all-purpose scissors, which can be used on all kinds of materials. Then I cut out 3 more of that shape. I was really happy with how sharp and precise these scissors are, and they made this step a lot easier than the dull pair I was using before I got these. If they're not exactly the same, you can line them up like this and trim the edges to match. If you divided your scarf in half like I did, the next step is to sew the 2 front pieces together at their short ends. But if your scarf pieces are already the length you need, skip ahead to the embroidery section of this tutorial. To attach the 2 halves together, start by cutting a length of embroidery floss that matches the color of your felt, then thread it onto an embroidery needle and tie a knot at the end. Then line up the short ends of the 2 pieces you want to join together like this. Start your needle at the corner between the 2 pieces so your knot will be hidden on the inside, then start whip stitching the pieces together along the short edges. If you are unfamiliar with this stitch or any of the other ones I'm using in this video, read the video description below for links to more detailed tutorials for those stitches. But basically, when you're whip stitching 2 pieces together like this, you'll be drawing a line across the gap where the felt pieces will connect, then inserting your needle diagonally into the direction where your next stitch will be. Repeat this motion along the edges you'd like to join. Once you've sewn all the way across the short edges, tie it off to secure it by opening up the pieces and pushing your needle through to the back where you can tie a knot. I do this by grabbing a nearby stitch with my needle and then pulling my needle through the loop that forms. That way the knot is tied right up against the fabric. Make a second knot like this if you want to and trim the excess. Repeat this step with the remaining felt pieces so you have 2 identical rectangles, the front of the scarf and the back. Now we'll embroider some cute snowflakes onto the front piece. Cut a length of white embroidery floss, thread it onto a needle, and then tie a knot at the end. Decide where you want to place your first big snowflake, but keep in mind that you should leave at least 1 inch for some fringe at each end of the scarf. Picture where you'll want the center of the snowflake to go, and push your needle up from the back in that spot. Then imagine where one arm of the snowflake will be reaching out from that center point, and push your needle back down at the end of that arm. Since snowflakes tend to be symmetrical, stitch a line mirroring the one you just made by pushing your needle up from the back at the end of an arm the same length but in the opposite direction from your first one. Then push your needle back down through the center point where your last line started. Continue stitching these little arms as you go around your snowflake, making a stitch on one side, then mirroring it on the other. You'll kind of want to imagine that the outer points of your snowflake form a circle, but remember that this can be a little messy. I love the imperfect charm of hand-stitched pieces like this. My snowflakes have 6 of these little arms, but feel free to make this more or less complicated if you'd like. You're only limited by your imagination here. Now I'm going to stitch 2 tiny V shapes over the top of each line. Push your needle up where you imagine the top right point of the first V to start, then push your needle down where the bottom point will go along the first arm of your snowflake. Repeat that step for the other side of the V, again imagining that the snowflake arm is a mirror and you're stitching its reflection, just like this. Then repeat this just underneath it with a second V shape on that same line. Once you're happy with this line, repeat that same process for each line all the way around the whole snowflake. This kind of stitching to me feels like drawing, but instead of putting ink to paper, you're thinking about each line you'll want to draw and making a stitch that goes along that line. This is what my finished snowflake looks like. To secure it in place, flip over the piece, push your needle under one of the stitches near where your thread is coming out from the front, and then as you're pulling it tight, put your needle through the loop that forms to make a knot. I usually do this twice just in case, then trim the excess embroidery floss with your scissors. Make as many of these big snowflakes as you'd like along the front side of your scarf. I stitched up 4 of them, then I decided to stitch some smaller ones as well. These are simpler versions of the big ones without stopping in the center of the snowflake and without the little V shapes on the arms. But they stitch up really quickly, so if you're having trouble with the big snowflakes, this is an example of something a little easier that you can stitch and still get that lovely wintry look. I did a small cluster of these little snowflakes, then turned the piece over and tied it off like I did before. Then you can move on to another cluster somewhere else on the scarf without having to reach too far across the back with your embroidery floss. Once I was totally happy with the embroidery, I decided to line my scarf with pipe cleaners so I could bend the scarf into the shape I wanted when I attach it to the fox plushie. You can skip this step if that isn't important to you. Start by folding over the ends of each pipe cleaner because they're sharp and they could poke through the felt if you don't. Because my pipe cleaners aren't long enough to reach along the whole length of the scarf, I combined 2 for each side by measuring how long I wanted them against the scarf, then I twisted 2 pipe cleaners together where they overlap like this. Keep in mind that we'll be making about 1 inch of fringe on each end, so you'll want your pipe cleaners to start 1 inch from each end of the scarf. To keep the 2 long pipe cleaners from getting too close together inside of the scarf, I cut 5 shorter lengths of pipe cleaner like this. Then, again measuring against the scarf to see how far apart they should go, I twisted one end of a shorter pipe cleaner onto one long one, then twisted the other end onto the other long one. It's a little bit hard to explain, so this might be easier to do by just watching the video and copying what I'm doing. I placed 5 of these along the 2 long pipe cleaners, 1 at each end and the other 3 spaced throughout the middle. It looks like this when it's ready. Place the piece onto the back layer of the scarf, then put your embroidered front piece on top so the pipe cleaners are sandwiched between those 2 layers. Use sewing pins to hold all 3 layers together, then we're ready to attach them. Thread a needle with a nice long piece of white embroidery floss and tie a knot at the end. Start a blanket stitch at least 1 inch in from the short end to leave room for the fringe. Push your needle up from between the layers of fabric so your knot won't be visible later and your thread is coming out of the front of the scarf like this. Then, blanket stitch the layers together along the long edges of the scarf. To blanket stitch, push your needle down through all of the layers next to where your thread is coming out. But before you pull it tight, pull your needle around the side and through the loop the thread makes like this. Again, read the video description for a more detailed blanket stitch tutorial if you need it. Continue all the way down the length of the scarf, keeping in mind that your needle goes down from the top through all of the layers each time and comes back around to the front around the side and through the loop. If you look at the side, you'll see that this stitch is holding the edges shut around the pipe cleaners so you won't be able to see them anymore. If you run out of embroidery floss along the way, it can be a little bit complicated to tie off your thread and start a new piece. I did this by tying a knot onto the pipe cleaner near where it happened and pushing the thread end inside of the layers of the scarf. Then I got a new piece of floss, tied a knot at the end, and started it right on top of the last stitch I made. Otherwise, there was a hole along the side and I didn't like the way that looked. Feel free to test out other ways to do this more seamlessly. Once you reach the end, tie a little knot along the side of your last blanket stitch so it stays up straight. Then we're going to sew a line of running stitches across the scarf 1 inch from the end where we'll be cutting the fringe later. Push your needle between the layers of felt and up through the front piece to start. Pull the pin out if you need to, then stitch in an up and down motion like this all the way across. When you get to the other side, make sure that your last stitch is coming up from the back, then you'll be in the perfect place to continue your blanket stitch up the other side. If your pipe cleaner pokes out at any point, just push it back in before you continue stitching. We're getting so close to finishing this project. Once you've finished your blanket stitches, sew one last row of running stitches across the other end of the scarf, 1 inch from the end, just like we did before. Then you basically just have to figure out where to tie a knot to keep it all together. I tied mine along the side, attached to the first blanket stitch we made earlier. Then, to hide the excess thread, I pushed the needle between the layers of fabric and out on the back of the scarf to hide it, then trimmed off the piece that stuck out. Remove all of the pins, then all we have to do is cut some fringe. Using these tiny Martha Stewart detail scissors, which are exactly the perfect length for this, I cut thin strips along each end of the scarf to simulate the yarn fringe you'd see at the end of a cozy knit scarf. If you don't have detail scissors, you can use longer ones. Just try to stop your cuts at the same length every time, and be careful not to cut into the stitches we made earlier. And now we're finished! This is what my scarf looks like. To attach it to a plush toy, bend it around the toy's neck and squeeze it where you want it to stay, like this, and the pipe cleaners will lightly hold that position. That way you don't have to sew it on to get it to stay, and you can remove it and switch it to another toy anytime you'd like. You could add one of these scarves to a stuffed toy you give as a gift this season to make it a little bit more unique, and even to give a store-bought toy an added handmade touch. It's like you're dressing up someone's gift just for them. I love how this scarf turned out. It gives this little guy a seasonal touch for the holidays, and you can customize it however you want by choosing different colors and even varying the embroidery design. If you decide to make one yourself, I'd love to see how it comes out. Send me a picture on Twitter @LaurenMyrtle or use #LaurenFairweather on Instagram. I want to thank Simplicity for sponsoring me on this video. It was such an easy project to make, and it totally got me into the holiday spirit. And if you do want to learn how to make this adorable fox plushie, be sure to watch the video that I made over on Simplicity's channel where I'll show you how to make it. Click here to see that, or check the video description for a link. Thanks for watching, happy holidays, and I'll see you soon.